The ceremony also produced an unforgettable incident involving the late Robert Frost, as the poet sought to read his inaugural ode.
I can't see in this light. Is about the new order of the ages, that God, that in their Latin, our founding sages, God gave us his approval of. Let me have it. I'll just have to get through as I can.
Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who do not know me, I am Adele Westfisher, the coordinator of library services, and we want to welcome you to this Robert Frost Remembrance here at the Athenaeum. We are so pleased that you were able to join us this afternoon. This event is a collaboration of the Northeast Storytellers with technical support from the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum as part of the St. Johnsbury PoemTown celebration and National Poetry Month. PoemTown St. Johnsbury is sponsored by the St. Johnsbury Chamber of Commerce, Discover St. Johnsbury, Catamount Arts, and of course, the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum. Now, what I want to do now is quit talking and turn this over to Mike Barron, and most of you already know him. In fact, I bet you all know him. You know, he's one of our poets up here in the Northeast Kingdom. He was the instrumental person in putting all of this presentation together. So, Mike, thank you so much for all your hard work. And I am now going to just turn this over to him. Okay, right. Mike, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Adele, and hello, everybody. Thanks to everybody for participating and attending. I know Bob's talked to all the people who are going to be screen sharing. You will be made a co-host for the time of your talk, and then he'll retract that. So just mention it to him. I know I said a lot about time issues in an email I sent around to you. Well, if we don't get all of our presenters and all our readers here, we may have a little bit more time. The event started really, I mean, I'd like to think that it had the most magnanimous intent and purposes behind it. But actually what happened was somebody in New Hampshire started a New Hampshire Hall of Fame for writers, and they inserted Robert Frost like within the first 15 minutes. And I thought, gosh, I thought he was a Vermonter. We're kind of proud of that. So that's kind of what the event, it started the event, but of course it's amazing. There's more and more to the guy. I should have started out with thanks to Bob and Adele and everybody at the Athenaeum for helping us put this on. It's raised our events, Northeast Storytellers, to another level. So why did we show that little clip of Robert Frost? It certainly didn't show him off to great in a perfect light, but in a way, that's what we're doing now. What happened was, as I understand the story, is JFK, who's also from Massachusetts, Massachusetts claims Robert Frost. Everybody does, I guess. There's enough of him to go around. Wanted to elevate his stature, and he did by letting him read a poem at the inauguration. The whole story around it, I'm going to leave that to somebody could do a whole segment on it. For example, it may not have been the standard story that his typewriter ink wasn't clear enough for him to read up there. It may be they didn't want him to read that. It was political. But the fading ink was that's kind of symbolic of where he was at that time. And it was really only after he did that poem at the inauguration that he became officially poet laureate of Vermont. So that's the connection between that and this. All right, for presentations, we have 4 or 5 folks, depending if Nancy shows up. And then we're going to have 5 readings by people who've written poems about or to Robert Frost. So with that, I introduce you to Jimmy Pappas, who was a finalist in the 2017 Rattled Poetry Contest. He won the 2018 Reader's Choice Award. His Falling Off the Empire State Building was the 2019 Rattle Chapbook Contest winner. His poem, The Gray Man, has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize by Rattle. His book, Scream Wounds, contains poems based on veteran stories. He currently he doesn't direct the Poetry Society of New Hampshire. Yes, he does. He directs their Zoom events is what he does. All right, Jimmy, I hand it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Jimmy Pappas, and I'm going to explain the invitation poem. And as I'm doing that, see if you can guess what Robert Frost's poem is his invitation poem before I tell you the title. So see if you can think of it. So an invitation poem would go at the front of a book. So I have here the complete poems of Robert Frost. The first poem should be his invitation poem, welcoming you to the book and encouraging you to read without really saying that. And just to give some examples, like Mary Oliver wrote an invitation poem where she said, "Oh, do you have time to linger for just a little while out of your busy and very important day?" And then she talks about birds and goldfinches in a field of thistles. She never mentions her poetry, but she's asking you if you have time to read her book. Walt Whitman, and I'll never forget this line from Song of Myself when I was in high school, he said, "This hour I tell things in confidence. I will not tell everybody, but I will tell you." And I thought Walt Whitman was talking right to me over 100 years or whatever. I will tell you. So he's telling me his secrets. And I thought that was such a great line. Now, with me, I did, in my book, I did a pancake breakfast, welcoming everybody to eat pancakes. And really what I'm doing is spreading out my poetry for people to read. So I encourage you, if you're a writer, to try and write an invitation poem. If you're a teacher, teach them. My students all had to write an invitation poem with their collected poetry when they put together their poems. And it's a great assignment. I really got some good ones doing that. So a few weeks ago, I'm getting ready to do this, prepare for this event. And I look at the table of contents and the poem isn't there. I mean, what the heck? I mean, I looked through it 3 times and then it turns out you turn past the table of contents and there it is. They don't even list it in the table of contents. It's sort of like separate from the rest of the poems. I was in a panic. I was going to really have to explain why it's not here after all this trouble, right? And the poem is called The Pasture. I'm going out to clean the pasture spring. I'll only stop to rake the leaves away and wait to watch the water clear. I may. I shan't be gone long. You come too. I'm going out to fetch the little calf that's standing by the mother. It's so young, it totters when she licks it with her tongue. I shan't be gone long. You come too. I love that word shan't. That's your homework for the week. You got to find somebody and use the word shan't in your conversation somehow. Figure out a way to plug that in there. Shan't, S-H-A apostrophe N apostrophe T. I shan't be gone long. You come too. Such a great line. I always loved that line when I read it. And then there's a little bit about poetry. Maybe when he's raking the leaves away and the water becomes clear, maybe it's about writing poetry that's clear and trying to understand his poetry. I think he was always accessible or tried to pretend he was. I really think he is deeper than he likes to let out to be. So with that, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy Pappas. That was short and sweet, and I didn't know what an invitation poem was. I imagined what I knew what it was. As long as we're guessing, can anybody figure out what my virtual background has to do with this discussion? All right, we'll take answers on that later. Nancy will be doing. She calls her presentation "Randall Thompson's Frostiana," a tribute to Robert Frost's song. Are you all set, Nancy? We're just waiting for you to start.
Will I picture be in the center like you are with the Golden Gate Bridge?
That's a very
here.
That's reserved for very special people, Nancy. But you will show up in. Just go ahead and do it, and Zoom will take care of it. They're very
okay. Thank you. I can start now. Way to go! Thank you, Michael. When my teaching career began in Del Mar, New York, in the late 1960s, I joined a community chorus and we perform Randall Thompson's Frostiana, a presentation of 7 of Robert Frost's poems, ending with what would become my favorite, Choose Something Like a Star. Born in 1899, Randall Thompson was similar to Frost in that he spent much of his childhood and adult life in New England. They eventually met and became good friends. In addition to their common love for New England, both men greatly respected each other's artistic accomplishments. In 1959, in honor of their 200th anniversary, the town of Amherst, Massachusetts, commissioned Thompson to compose a choral work set to one of Robert Frost's poems. The town was known for its association with Robert Frost, who had lived there for some years. They initially selected the gift outright, but Thompson asked for permission to select his own text from among Frost's work. The end result was Frostiana, 7 country songs, which Thompson composed in about 3 weeks while in Switzerland. Frost, now 85 years old, heard the piece for the first time at its premiere at the Amherst Regional High School in Amherst on October 18, 1959. Thompson conducted the premiere and used the bicentennial chorus made up of local singers with piano accompaniment. According to some reports, Robert Frost was so delighted by the performance that at the conclusion of the piece, he stood up and shouted, "Sing that again." Following my reading, you will hear the piece performed by the New York Choral Society with the Manhattan Chamber Orchestra with photos from the Hubble telescope. A layering effect of musical meaning over poetic meaning is clear in Choose Something Like a Star. In the opening and closing sections, the sopranos sing the text, "O Star," and hold the note for several measures while the rest of the choir continues with the text of the poem. In this way, Thompson creates a musical image of a distant star. Choose Something Like a Star by Robert Frost. O star, the fairest one in sight, we grant your loftiness the right to some obscurity of cloud. It will not do to say of night, since dark is what brings out your light. Some mystery becomes the proud, but to be wholly taciturn in your reserve is not allowed. Say something to us we can learn by heart, and when alone repeat. Say something, and it says, I burn. But say with what degree of heat. Talk Fahrenheit, talk centigrade. Use language we can comprehend. Tell us what elements you blend. It gives us strangely little aid, but does tell something in the end. And steadfast as Keats' eremite, not even stooping from its sphere, it asks a little of us here. It asks of us a certain height. So when at times the mob is swayed to carry praise or blame too far, we may choose something like a star to stay our minds on and be stayed. Thank you.
Wow. Nancy, thank you. Wow, that is a beautiful presentation there. Right now, we have a fellow who's no stranger to the Poetry Society of Vermont. In fact, he currently serves as the president. He retired from Vermont Technical College as professor and department chair of the Department of English, Humanities, and Social Sciences. His poems have been published in journals, including Atlanta Review, Seneca Review, and Whale Road Review. Whale, not rail. Whale Road Review. And so George Longenecker is going to give us a background on a Robert Frost poem, Out, Out, which is based on an actual incident in Littleton, New Hampshire in 1910. So George, assuming you're ready, we'll hand it over to you.
I'm ready. Thank you, Michael. And if you could just share screen, Bob, when you're ready. So Out, Out was written in 1915 and published in Frost's book Mountain Interval in 1916 when Frost was living in Franconia. Let's see, I don't have screen share yet. I wanted to show you the poem.
Second, George. I'm having a little trouble here.
If not, I'll just read it.
Nope, it's coming right up, right? You should be good to go.
It's working. I'll be. Out, out. The buzzsaw snarled and rattled in the yard and made dust and dropped stove-length sticks of wood. Sweet-scented stuff when the breeze drew across it. And from there, those that lifted eyes could count 5 mountain ranges, one behind the other, under the sunset far into Vermont. And the saw snarled and rattled as it ran light or had to bear a load. And nothing happened. Day was all but done. Call it a day, I wish they might have said, to please the boy by giving him the half hour that a boy counts so much when saved from work. His sister stood beside him in her apron to tell them supper. At the word she saw, as if to prove saws knew what supper meant, leaped out at the boy's hand, or seemed to leap. He must have given the hand. However it was, neither refused the meeting. But the hand, the boy's first outcry was a rueful laugh as he swung toward them, holding up the hand, half in appeal, but half as if to keep the life from spilling. Then the boy saw all, since he was old enough to know, big boy doing a man's work, though a child at heart, he saw all spoiled. Don't let them cut my hand off. The doctor, when he comes, don't let them, sister. So, but the hand was gone already. The doctor put him in the dark of ether. He lay and puffed his lips out with his breath. And then the watcher at his pulse took fright. No one believed. They listened at his heart. Little less, nothing, and that ended it. No more to build on there. And they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs. So it is based on an actual incident, which I'll tell you about in a minute. There's been a lot of discussion about whether the end of this poem is callous or stoic. I would tend to say more stoical. What choice did they have except to go on living? In her book, Robert Frost, The People, Places, and Stories Behind His New England Poetry, she discusses out, and the actual incident. And Frost often often said that this poem was too cruel to read in public. The March 31st, 1910 edition of the Littleton Courier in New Hampshire carried the following story. Raymond Tracy Fitzgerald, one of the twin sons of Michael G. and Margaret Fitzgerald of Bethlehem, died at his home Thursday afternoon, March 24th, as the result of an accident by which one of his hands was badly hurt in a sawing machine. The young man was assisting in sawing up some wood in his own dooryard with a sawing machine and accidentally hit the loose pulley, causing the saw to descend upon his hand, cutting and lacerating it badly. Raymond was taken into the house and a physician was immediately summoned, but he died very suddenly from the effects of the shock, which produced heart failure. So Frost had known the family in 1910 when he was staying in Bethlehem, and then wrote about it later after he returned from England and was living in Franconia. Today, the boy probably would be medevaced to Dartmouth Hitchcock Hospital or rushed to Littleton Hospital and then transferred to Dartmouth Hitchcock, and they would have saved his life and possibly the hand. There's darkness and tragedy in Robert Frost and loneliness as well. For instance, home burial and the fear in his book North of Boston, and loneliness. And I think one of his most lovely poems and one of his few urban poems, Desert Places. But he's a much more complex poet than he's often given credit for. And I think Out and The Fear and Home Burial and Desert Places show the complexity of Frost.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Wow. All right. I think George may have learned how to use the mirror video feature on Zoom. Is that correct, George? Well, you're muted now. That might be something for some people. If you want to show something into your camera, you might want to try to find that feature. Speaking of which, now somebody who wants to show us a few things, Middlebury College. We bring you the college archivist at Middlebury College in Middlebury, Vermont, Danielle Rougeau. And she's got a lot to say about their various Robert Frost holdings down there. But she wants to focus on Christmas cards, Robert Frost Christmas cards that were printed by the Spiral Press in 1929. So if Danielle's ready, we will go to her now.
I'm ready. All righty. Thank you, Michael. And thank you for letting me be part of this event. Yes, so I'm the college archivist, and I'm going to go very quickly just to tell you about some of the ways you can access parts of our collection, but then to focus on those Christmas cards. There we go. I'm getting rid of my face. All righty, there we go. So Middlebury's earliest association with Robert Frost was in 1921. Oh, wait a minute, I'm not in my, hold on. There we go. I'm not at my beginning. Here we go. So Robert Frost was first associated with Middlebury in 1921. He attended the second Bredlow School of English summer session in Ripton, Vermont. From the mid-30s on, Frost was a regular lecturer at the Bredlow campus in the summers, and he made memorable appearances at the college over the rest of the time of the year. Of our Frost resources, the Abernethy Collection of American Literature holds first editions of all of Frost's books, as well as many pamphlets. All are cataloged in Middlebury's online library catalog, MidCat. Special Collections is also the home of realia from the Frost cabin from Ripton, including his Morris chair, his radio, a cardigan sweater, a walking cane, and what we refer to as his laptop, which is a little handmade piece of wood he would use to write on while he was sitting in his chair. Middlebury's focused a considerable amount of time digitizing resources, including texts, photographs, and audio and video recordings. Our digital resources are accessible on the Internet Archive, which you can access from our Special Collections website. If you were to search for Robert Frost, you would find videos of digitized 16mm film, audio recordings from reel-to-reels, primarily his Breadloaf School of English lectures from the 1950s, for which we have transcriptions, and photographs of Frost, mostly from the Breadloaf campus, that show him lecturing and also playing tennis and softball. Archive Space is the software we use to create online finding aids for our manuscript collections. So like Internet Archive, it's accessible from the Special Collections website. When you search for Robert Frost, you will get his for collections that include correspondence and manuscripts by Frost, including the collections of Lawrence Thompson, Reginald Cook, Louis Untermeyer, Breadloaf, and the Abernethy collection. The collection I'll highlight briefly here is the Wales Hawkins Memorial Collection of Frostiana, which was donated by Corinne Tennyson Davids in 1960. Besides first editions, it has correspondence, radio recordings, photographs, inventories, and ephemera. But what I think is probably most beautiful is it includes a complete set of 28 Frost Christmas cards. These finely designed holiday cards, which are really like small art booklets, feature original Frost poems hand-printed by the Spiral Press by founder and master printer Joseph Blumenthal. In his book, Robert Frost and His Printers, which is in the Abernethy collection at Middlebury, Blumenthal writes about not only aspects of letterpress and design, but also how a meaningful collaboration deepened a friendship with Frost for over 33 years. The story of printing Robert Frost, says Blumenthal, becomes a very personal story, but that is the heart of the matter. I have printed books by other living American poets. They were all presentable books, but they were never my best work. The Frost books and Christmas cards have been my best work, and Robert Frost is why. He cared completely. He never interfered, but he cared deeply. The tradition of the Frost Christmas cards had a slightly shaky beginning in 1929. The Spiral Press was designing a limited edition of Frost's collected poems, and Blumenthal decided that he would like to use Frost's poem Christmas Trees as a holiday greeting for he and his wife Anne. He secured permission from Holt to print a first separate edition, but failed to ask whether Frost might want copies for himself. Frost later agreed to forgive the gaffe if Blumenthal could provide him with a half dozen copies. Fortunately for Blumenthal, 6 of his friends reluctantly gave up their copies. In November of 1962, Frost sent Blumenthal the poem for that year's Christmas card and made his final visit to New York City. He was receiving the McDowell Colony Medal at Hunter College, and the auditorium was packed. Blumenthal noted that Frost was in top form, brilliant and witty, with no indication that within a few weeks he would be taken to hospital for his final illness. The 1962 Christmas card was mailed just 6 weeks before Frost's death. What began as a small reprint of Greetings to Friends became a special tradition of Frost first editions. There are 28 Frost Christmas cards, 25 of which are printed by the Spiral Press. 17 of the poems are true first editions. The other 11 are first separate editions. 13 artists contributed illustrations, and Frost himself designed the 1939 card with the first edition of Triple Plate. The cards and booklets are roughly the size of your hand. The poems are printed on handmade paper in a typeface designed by Blumenthal, and with an ink formulated by Blumenthal he called Frost Black. From an edition of 275 for the first 1929 card, the final card in 1962 had a printed edition of 17,055. Middlebury professor and Frost biographer Jay Perini suggests that Robert Frost became America's favorite poet by writing accessible poems, creating a uniquely appealing persona, and pioneering the public reading of poems. Robert Frost himself suggests another reason. Spiral's typography and printing found things to say to my poetry that were never said before. There is much more to say about the Frost Christmas cards, not only about their form, but what brought them to life. They are meant to be held and experienced. I invite you to visit Special Collections website to access our online digitized Frost resources and to visit the reading room at Davis Family Library, where Frost's original manuscripts can offer a new perspective. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Danielle. I had no knowledge. I'm a Christmas freak too, of the Robert Frost Christmas cards, and I guess they went all those years, every year, 29 through 62.
Well, he missed 3 years. The war years were not printed by the Spiral Press because the Spiral Press shut. Oh, something's happening. Sorry about that. I'm having a funny sound, so never mind. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks again, Danielle. I did warn Shard that that Danielle was going to be a hard act to follow, but I knew he'd be up to it. Shard Daniord served as a poet laureate of Vermont from 2015 to 2019. He's the author of 6 books of poetry, most recently My Unknowing, which is put out by the University of Pittsburgh Press in 2020. He's authored 2 books of interviews with eminent American poets titled Sad Friends, Drowned Lovers, Stapled Songs, which came out in 2011 on Merrick Press, and I Would Lie to You If I Could, which is also University of Pittsburgh Press in 2018. Shard, this afternoon, will be giving us a mini presentation. Well, actually, I think he's going to be reading an essay, but he'll tell us more about that. And if you're ready, we're going to hand it over to you, Mr. Daniord.
George reminded me of something that I think is important about Frost's career. His career didn't really take off, or he wasn't considered as serious a poet as some of his modernist colleagues like Eliot and Stevens, until about 1958. At his 80, I forget which birthday, first or second birthday at the Waldorf Astoria, Lionel Trilling stood up and said, "So radical a work, I need scarcely say, is not carried out by reassurance, nor by the reaffirmation of old virtues and pieties. It is carried out by the representation of the terrible actualities of life in a new way. I think of Robert Frost as a terrifying poet. Call him, if it makes things any easier, a tragic poet. But it might be useful every now and then to come out from under the shelter of that literary word, the universe, that he conceives is a terrifying universe." And that poem that George read out is certainly evidence of that. I'm just going to read a section of an essay that I wrote.
Didn't get that. Could you try again?
Oops. Just going to, are you still hearing me okay?
Sorry, I'm still not sure about that.
Oops.
We are hearing you and her.
Okay, I don't know what these voices are. I'm going to read an essay from an essay that I published in a book called Vermont Poets and Their Crafts, and it was also in Vermont Life, which was a fairly long essay on Frost called Suspense, Suspension in the Sublime in the Poetry of Robert Frost. I don't know if people have noticed this about a lot of Frost poems, but he suspends his characters in trees, the top of staircases, like as in The Witch of Coos, or in Home Burial. I'm going to read a little bit about that today, or The Cherry Tree, or After Apple Picking, Birches. He loved to suspend his characters and create suspense in their suspension, with the intention of writing something ultimately sublime about them. So I'm just going to jump in here at the near the end of this essay. to talk about home burial, or to read a little bit about home burial here. It was published in, as George mentioned, 1917 in north of Boston. In this dramatic dialogue, Frost suspends a grievous couple separately. First the wife, and then the husband at the top of a staircase. The poem begins with Amy, the mother, at the top of the stairs, looking back, quote, over her shoulder at some fear, end of quote, which her husband informs the reader is the little, quote, the little graveyard where his people are, end of quote, and now their child. Frost suspends Amy in the first line of the poem in a posture that embodies T.S. Eliot's idea of objective correlative. That is, quote, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which shall be the formula of that particular emotion, end of quote, which in this case is enacted by Amy's fearful backward glance out the window at the graveyard when her husband approaches her at the top of the stair where she cowered under him with a face that, quote, changed from terrified to dull, end of quote. They stand suspended together, but with such utterly different dispositions, they can't remain together there for long. She withdraws, shrinking from beneath his arm, challenging her husband to see what she sees, referring to him as a, quote, blind creature, end of quote. He says he sees, but she disagrees. Quote, you don't, she tells him. Tell me what it is, he ventures as an unsatisfactory answer. Broad, quote, broad-shouldered little slabs there in the sunlight on the side hill. We haven't to mind those, but I understand it is not the stones, but the child's mound. Amy responds like King Lear after Cordelia's death with a slew of renunciations, quote, don't, end of quote. She withdraws at this point in the poem and slides downstairs as if floating, still suspended in her grief. Quote, can't a man speak of his own child he lost? End of quote, her husband asks desperately, to which Amy responds with this brutal indictment of her husband's verbal deficit. Quote, you can't because you don't know how to speak. If you had any feelings, you that dug with your hand, how could you, his little grave, end of quote. Frost ties feeling to language itself here, signifying the poetry as a feminine strength. Amy knows how to speak, while her husband is at a loss for the right words. He concedes to his wife, quote, we must have some arrangement by which I'd bind myself to keep hands off, anything you're a mind to name, end of quote, which apparently would include himself also, since he goes nameless throughout the poem. Every attempt he makes to comfort Amy only results in exacerbating her heartbreak. Quote, my words are nearly always an offense, he confesses. Quote, I don't know how to speak of anything so as to please you, but I might be taught, I should suppose, end of quote. But no, he is unteachable, as well as blind, unfeeling, and dumb as far as Amy is concerned. By the end of the poem, her resentment toward her husband has evolved into a disconsolate global keening. Quote, I shall laugh the worst laugh I ever laughed. I'm cursed. God, if I don't believe, I'm cursed. I can repeat the very words you were saying. 3 foggy mountains in 1 rainy day will not the best birch fence a man can build, will rot the best birch fence a man can build. Think of it, talk like that at such a time. How long it takes a birch to rot to do with what was in the darkened parlor. You couldn't care? The nearest friends can go with anyone to death, come so far short, they might as well not try to go at all. No, from the time when one is sick to death, one is alone, and he dies more alone. Friends make pretense of following to the grave, but before one is in it, their minds are turned and making the best of their way to life and living people and things they understand. But the world is evil. I won't have grief so if I can change it. Oh, I won't. End of quote. The poem ends in despair, with Amy threatening to flee aimlessly as her husband threatens to bring her back by force. Frost, in his remarkably accurate empathy with Amy, suspends her in no woman's land, betraying greatness of soul in his ability to grip the high voltage wire of a mother's grief barehanded, as well as her indictment of the world as evil, that is, as a place where friends make pretense of following to the grave. Frost portrayed several female characters in extremity with rare passion. This really isn't stressed enough that Frost did this. And insight throughout his career in such poems as The Subverted Flower, Wild Grapes, The Witch of Coos, The Fear, The Hill Wife, Paul's Wife, and Two Witches. Women speak in these poems from suspended vantage points above their patriarchal worlds with terror, fear, loneliness, and wisdom. Home Burial, however, represents, at least in my opinion, the most exquisite example of Frost's genius for negative capability, which is that term from Keats, where he said that a poet needs to exist in uncertainty, mystery, doubt, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. As a middle-aged male poet, immersing himself in the uncertainty and mystery of a grieving mother. The impasse Frost creates in this poem, at the risk of losing his reader's sympathy for his protagonist, Amy, disturbs the reader deeply. But it's a transcendent poem for this very reason, witnessing to the inscrutable calculus of loss for which there are neither words nor solution, nor any place on earth, much less home, for a mourner like Amy to seek refuge or understanding. The abyss into which she's about to bolt, somewhere out of this house, she says at the end of the poem, leaves her husband, herself, and the reader in a state of terrible suspension and suspense. But that is exactly where Frost wishes to leave us, all with the Shakespearean courage and belief in our human capacity to stare into it, that quote, somewhere out of this house, end of quote. Thrilling and chilling are the two words that describe Frost's most sublime poems, such as the four, well, I've discussed four in this essay, but this one here. Frost, perhaps more than any other American poet, mythologized a landscape that continues to be known simply as Frost Country, a landscape on which he wrote his recurrent obsessions, to borrow a phrase from the art historian Simon Schama, or as Frost called them, his quarrels. These now classic quarrels have made it close to impossible for any poet to follow Frost in these parts without echoing his work, if even in the slightest reference to a tree or a wall or a hillside. Which is why I think the Vermont legislature waited 26 years before appointing the next Vermont state poet, the deserving Galway Connell, in 1989. Despite several shocking waves of the new that have transpired since Frost's death in 1963, from postmodernism to the recent welcome explosion of multicultural voices, readers continue to hang with Frost in his native trees, woods, and roads, where they still feel utterly haunted by his narratives, monologues, and dramas. Frost harrows his readers beyond horror with terrors that compel even non-readers of poetry to return again and again for more than just the mere odd pleasure of being frightened, but to discover vicariously that their lives, our lives, are extraordinary, fragile, difficult, painful, bittersweet, contradictory, ecstatic, and grievous. Not that we don't know these things already, but not in the terrifying way that Frost conveys in his best poems. By conveying the felt presence of human experience in physical interactions with the world, Frost divines passage to his readers' psyches through their bodies first, and then their minds and hearts. We feel the abstractions he quarrels with in our bones, whether it's the factual dreams of labor or the limits of human consciousness, or the affirmation of earth as the right place for love, or the inconsolable reality of grief. Frost's language finds us, enchants us, suspends us, and then leaves us captured in our own willful restraints. Thank you.
Thank you, Shard. Thank you, Shard.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm reminded that Robert Frost is laid to rest in the old Bennington Cemetery in Bennington, and on his gravestone, in all capital letters, is the inscription, "I had a lover's quarrel with the world." So I was thinking about that when you were telling us about his quarrels.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sharp. We now have 5 readings. I know 4 of the people are here, so it'll be a mystery if all 5 show up. We're starting out with Dan Close, who's the current treasurer of the Poetry Society of Vermont. Dan first visited Franconia Notch in 1944 at the age of 4 and has been enthralled with the area ever since. He's going to do his original poem, Frost's Mountain. So I hand it over to Dan.
Thank you, Mike. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yeah.
Good. Let's go on a ramble now with Mr. Frost. Imagine we're standing on the porch of the Frost farmhouse in Franconia, and we're looking south over Franconia Notch. That huge mountain right in front of you is Mount Lafayette. I call it Frost's Mountain. The mountain was his lodestone, his magic. And like a special hidden power, he never mentioned it but once, except obliquely, by inference. The Purple Mountain, he called it, and only once he wrote its name that I could find, and never wrote its poem. The mist cascading down the mountain, but frozen into place in the glacier-gouged ravine there on the north face, placed there by the gods for us to see, if gods be glaciers from 20,000 years ago, if glaciers be gods from old Norse legends of sea mist and dragon ship. He was, after all, just a man, not a legend, not then. That would be for later. His face more chiseled later. For now, face rugged, craggy yet to come. Not Hawthorne's poet. Well, perhaps he was, but not the legend yet. Strange, though, he never wrote about the Great Range to the south. North of Boston it was indeed, and he north of it. Now, that's a piece far north more than most people would like to travel. Days, nights, winters, summers, he stuck it out, longer than any of them. And the Great Range never gave him scraps of poems. He never wrote them down. There is a strangeness there. It is a living thing. Nothing to do with us, no matter how we look at it. He bought the farmhouse for the mountain. That was that. All there was to it. Price doubled, paid without a murmur. Then set to work, to farm, to clear the spring. Emerging in the early morning sun, he'd heave a sigh, look south down to that misty-filled valley between the 2 containing mountains of the Notch. How much it must have stymied him, beguiled him, conquered him. How much Hawthorne must have troubled him as he nibbled round the edges of that old man's work. What caused that work to work? So, a sigh, a tightened belt, a grab for the axe, off to work on kindling for the winter to better the size of the woodpile while shattering logs of cordwood into kindling. Feeling the warmth of the day as it slipped by in morning hours, back on the porch, stupefied and satisfied with work, another look at the monster Blue Mountain. A snort, and the sound of the screen door slamming shut, his wife jumping a little, wondering at his frame of mind this day. Anger was his, and would remain so. But he was there this day to recognize the thing brought on by that hill, that damned hill that stood and mocked him and his powers. Why, he would ask his farmer neighbor, the 2 of them heaving rocks back on the ancient common wall one by one, Why, he would say, does that old pile of rocks down there stand winter's blast so well? Why doesn't it collapse into its notch and fill it up? Tried it once, said the neighbor. Still see the scar. Notch is bigger than you'd expect. Then after resting, sighing, gazing off with hands on hips. Come on, Robert, let's get this last big one up on top. Robert, you there? Robert smiled, put away the thoughts and concepts of the great blue mountain for the smaller greatness of the flat granite stone that stood between them. Then, letting out his breath in one big whooshing sigh, bent down and grasped that rock on his side, neighbor on his. Together they lifted, placed it, set it stone on stone, looked at it through sweaty eyes, and then at each other, much as to say, okay by you? Until this time next year, said the neighbor finally, grinning. That satisfied Robert, who turning, waved, said, next year then. Laughing at himself and his foolishness about time and his mountain both, he turned and went back home. His tussle with the hill could wait. If that great blue huck thought it had all the patience in the world, he would show it he had some piece of patience too. Perhaps, he thought, he was not yet the man to match the mountain, but he would take something out of this day, his work, alongside of his farmer neighbor. He would use that, stone for stone, and see what that would build. And wait to see what that big old blue mountain had in store for him. He grimaced with the hurt both in his back and mind, and went back home to work his poetry again. And he would hone his patience with the mountain and work on that piece in some distant future time, hazed over for now. But still the gem was there, he knew. He would have patience for that poem to come to light, and when it did, he would be waiting for it, and take it by the neck or wing and wrestle it to the ground. The afternoon was growing dim when he sat down at his old desk, his mind set on stone, but not in stone. It was still agile, even at this time of day, he figured, and he commenced to write.
Okay, Dan, thank you so much. We got to move along, clickety clack. Florence Fogelin is here. Her second poetry book, Explanatory Value, is due out in the fall, and she's going to read her poem, Letter to Robert Frost. Florence, I hand it over to you.
I'm happy to have a sample of the book, and it will be out in another month. And Sid Lee wrote a blurb, so thank you, Sid. A letter to Robert Frost for Seamus Heaney, 1939 to 2013. I went to Franconia recently and sat on your porch, wishing we could talk about the late Seamus Heaney, who, but for age, could have been your friend, an Irish poet, like you, a classicist. Years ago, I lunched with him in a Vermont farmhouse, much like yours, old and small, with walls awry and doors that wouldn't close. Words and cadences poured from him as freely as the wine we drank, laughing together before he talked soberly to a crowded college room. Then he won the Nobel Prize. I heard his interview on BBC for Pick Your Favorite Poem Day. Asked for his, Heaney didn't really want to say. Forced, well, the Iliad, a choice that wouldn't do. We mean in English. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Robert Frost. Who? an American, no longer living. You and Heaney walked on earth, your poems rooted in the soil of speech, not in a hothouse of rich vocabulary. The very there you are and where are you of poetry itself, said Heaney. Wherever you are, I hope you've welcomed him, invited him to dinner, shared words and whiskey. To love poetry is to study it, you said. I see you as neighbors, elbows on the kitchen table, talking craft, suspicious, eyeing, testing one another as one might test the sharpness of a knife. By the way, Rudyard Kipling's If won the Pick Your Favorite Poem Day. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Florence. Thank you so much. Steve Parker is a tree farmer with a deep love of poetry, particularly the poetry of Robert Frost. He's going to read a poem he wrote called Night in the Sugar House. I hand it over to you, Steve.
Thank you. My mother's father, Raymond Holden, was a poet and naturalist. He was also a neighbor and lifetime friend of Robert Frost. Raymond died in 1972, and some of his letters and other writing came into my mother's hand. Among those were 320 pages of autobiography. Sadly, it sat unread in my barn for many years. This year I retrieved it and read it, and I have excerpted an account of an evening Raymond spent with Frost making maple syrup. Tonight I am reading Raymond's words with a bit of careful pruning by me to shape them into something like a narrative poem reminiscent of one of Frost's own. Night in the Sugar House. During the first post-war years, I spent as much time as I could walking in the New Hampshire woods, tramping and talking with Robert Frost. In 1920, he left Franconia for South Shaftesbury, Vermont, but not before we had shared some memorable experiences. Robert enjoyed the scope and ceremony of sugaring. He asked me to join him one evening in March, when the fire in the sugar house was lighted and the vat above it full of freshly gathered sap. I walked down the hill from my house after supper. As I made the last turn and reached the stand of maples and the moon shadows of trunks and branches crisscrossed on the March snow, I could see through the cracks of the sugar house wall the flickers of firelight tinting the snow near the house. The end doors of the sugar house were wide open, and in the firelight I could see Robert kneeling in front of the open door of the furnace on which the set pan was. Robert greeted me with his usual genial reticence. Pretty night, isn't it? How are things up your way? All right? It really feels like spring, I said. Robert continued feeding sticks of maple into the long furnace. I took the short wooden paddle and began helping move the thickening set from the upper end of the long pan on down to the spigot end. The wood smoke and steaming maple sap that March night seemed to me the fragrance of the earth coming to life before the earth itself had begun to stir. I remember the firelight upon Robert's face, which always gave the impression of trying to decide whether to speak or to whistle. He was happy in the task, the happiness coming from work which blended effort and will. During much of our time in the sugar house, we were silent. Robert occasionally asked me questions about my life and the house up on the hill. They did not always seem to require an answer. I could tell he learned as much from my silence as my answers. I was glad, for there were things I could not have told. There was less silence when we spoke of poetry. There was little light, but that of one oil lantern hung from a rafter. Robert insisted that you cannot be a politician and a poet and keep politics out of your poetry. But if you don't keep it out, your poetry will suffer. He declared that a person has to choose what they intend to be. I had been working on a poem in which a grackle appeared. I referred to the grackle's voice in these words: "The ratchet grackle winds his drum." I was thinking of a child's drum operated by a ratchet, which made a sound like a grackle. Most people, I was afraid, would not know what I was talking about. Robert reassured me that if the description was right, it made no difference whether readers knew the source of it. They would get a bonus. They would be made acquainted both with grackle and child's drum. Robert and I stayed up all night to run through the entire batch of sets. One of the subjects of our talk was baseball, of which we were both extravagantly. Our neighbor, Will Herbert, looked in. Robert said Will was a man you could trust. He had sold the Frosts a horse for $90 with no sales talk at all. As soon as the $90 was paid, however, and the horse delivered, many excellences in the horse were recounted. How fast the horse could run, how great a load he could pull, how easy he was to harness, how he had saved his brother's life while logging by pushing the man out from under the fallen tree. Several times Robert and I went out to fetch more wood. We stood for a while in the moonlight, watching the glitter of the frozen rivulets, which in the afternoon before had been water running down the sloping orchard. When I saw Robert a day later, he showed me the poem entitled "A Hillside Thaw," which appeared in his next volume called New Hampshire. After Robert left Franconia, I did most of my woods walking by myself.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Very well done. Lakshman Balusu
Yeah,
is a New Jersey-based poet and member of the Poetry Society of New Hampshire. He is a Barnes & Noble educator, and he invented the Star Poem Poetic Form in 2016. He is published in literary magazines in the US and India, and in poetry anthologies in the US, Taiwan, and India. All right, and with that, Lakshman is ready, I believe. I hand it over to you, sir.
thank you. My poem is called The Best Memorial. It is on the Robust Frost Farm in Derry, New Hampshire that I visited quite some years ago. The Best Memorial. Derry Farm bears a boy's will, quote unquote, as he poetized his experiences on this farm. It retains its originality along with the vases. The kitchen with old cups and plates, the dining table with forks and spoons, the bedrooms and more. Each sight of them seems to evoke a verse. And complementing this, the ink bottle, and beside it, the pen with its nib. Each sight surrounding the farm seems to capture the light of those days of a strolling bard, quote unquote, of New Hampshire, on this farm. This homestead, with its farm bordered by a rocky fence, breathes an air of fragrant yesteryears to immortalize itself as the best memorial, as ageless as the poet and his poems. Thank you.
Thank you, Lakshman. I hope I'm somewhere in the ballpark of pronouncing your name properly, but thank you for zooming in. And last but certainly not least, Steve Parker's brother is joining us. I believe they both grew up on a family farm in North Danville. Scudder Parker and his wife Susan live in Middlesex. He's published in Sun Magazine, Vermont Life, Northern Woodlands, Crosswinds, Aquifer, and Sky Island journals. His first volume of poetry, Safe as Lightning, was released in June 2020 by Rootstock Publishing. His mother spent summers on the land in Franconia, New Hampshire. Now, I'm going to assume that somehow that you're talking about the Frost land, something like that. Maybe you'll explain. Anyway, certainly, like I said, this will end our readings and I believe our event for this evening. I give you Scudder Parker.
Thank you. I just wanted to share this. This is the picture I mentioned in the poem. And that, you know, Frost, and the other one is my grandfather, Raymond Holden, who Steve has already written about. So you get the family stereo version of Frost. My picture of my grandfather is a little different. It's called Literary Legacy for my grandfather, Raymond Holden. My mother's father had priorities, but my mother and her children weren't among them. He was so thorough in his absence that we never learned to care. And yet, a picture of him next to Robert Frost sits on my desk. Franconia, New Hampshire, on land Frost sold him as he, still married to my grandmother, pursued Frost's daughter. A snapshot in the corner of the frame finds me perched on his shoulders, his hands on my legs, mine on his ears, the only childhood picture of us that I have. I never got to meet his second wife, Louise Bogan, whose poems ache with departure. His third wife, a poet too, reached past his indifference to us. Adventure came on all her visits. She helped me build a stick and bark house in the woods. Hushed, hunched, we spied for deer. With delicate precision, one came near. Raymond worked for years at the New Yorker, wrote poems Randall Jarrell paused long enough to savage, painstakingly, conventionally, determinedly rhetorical. Wealth, family, Princeton, prominence, his entitlement. His fourth wife, 2 years older than my mother, assumed the mantle guardian of a great literary man. I never shared my parents' fierce judgment. It felt like sadness in disguise. To me, he was a man content with his pretenses. His poems dense and desolate, contorted by a cleverness of subtle violence. I wonder if he told himself his absence was a sacrifice we'd come to understand. I only hear his awkward, privileged silence. Thank you.
Okay, Scudder Parker, thank you so much. And everybody who read, everybody who presented, everybody who's attending this event only. Bob and Adele, it's up to you. I know we'd very much like to hear about the Robert Frost resources at the Athenaeum, but we're right up against our maximum time limit. I know that too. So I hand it over to Bob or Adele.
Adele, go ahead. Take your time. And Michael, thank you. And everybody, thank you for coming. We don't have to rush away.
Well, I'm going to make this quick. Oh, where's my video? I lost my video. Okay, start video. Okay, I really and truly, I'm just going to tell you where to find this. If you're left craving more Robert Frost books, poems, all that stuff, if you go to the Athenaeum website and you go back to the event announcement, you will see a link there for 17 resources. Part of them are authored by Robert Frost, and part of them are like about Robert Frost from other folks. So I'm not going to spend time sharing that screen because you can easily go click on that link, and each resource on there, each book is highlighted so that if you click on that resource, you can see where in our collection you can find that, and they are available for checkout. There is one thing I do want to show you that's just a point of interest. Bob shared this with me. Oh, where is it? Uh-oh. Oh, here it is. In the book that Bob has in his office, it's called New Hampshire by Robert Frost. Let's see, can I get this to come up really quick? Okay, share. Can you see my screen?
We do. Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
this is great. This poem, in a disused graveyard, is printed in this book, but you can see where he has like rewritten this in his hand right in the front of the book. I thought that was really quite awesome. And then you can see his signature. This book, however, is not available for checkout, but if you are very kind to Bob Jolly, he might be willing to show you this. So I thought this was quite interesting. And we have our very own handwritten signature there for Robert Frost. I am going to stop just make my thank yous now. And then hand it off to Mike for a final word. Thank you for such a delightful afternoon. I've enjoyed all our readings, as I'm sure all of you have. Mike, a very heartfelt thank you to all the work you have put into putting this event together. Again, another successful event. Thank you so very much. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to say a final goodbye and a thank you.
All right. So all things Frost, head to the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum. The people are wonderful. It's open to the public, that place right now. It's got a lot of online stuff. Every time I open their website, it says something about how I can watch 30,000+ movies with my library card. They even let me take coffee in there. So that place is a great resource. I was telling somebody today, I suspect that's the best small town public library in the entire universe. It's an amazing place. Thank you, Bob and Adele. And I've been mispronouncing Bob's last name my entire life, I've discovered. As a wrap up, I didn't get to do, I have a kind of a list of the tie-ins between Robert Frost and Vermont, which is the whole point of this event we started 6 years ago. I will email the link to that. I will get you that if you ask me for it. We can do that. The recording, Adele told you Bob will look that over, see if that's worthwhile. We'll put that out, I hope. I would love to have a list of attendees, and we're working on that. You might get an email from me, thank you or whatever. And I just can't thank the Athenaeum enough. Everybody who came, readings were wonderful. The presentations were par excellence. And I look forward to doing this event again sometime. Thank you again.